Polypede works here. I find it super interesting that we're in the Egghead arc now. We're finding out more and more about Kuma's backstory and what he went through throughout his life. But that kind of brings me back to Cutty Flam, otherwise known as Frankie. I don't know if this was Oda's intent or not, but it seems like over the 2-year time skip especially, he kind of turned Frankie into this weird parody of Kuma, which I think is great because over the course of the story, Kuma, the pacifistas, and now the Seraphim kind of feel more like Terminator allegories. These killer robots, even though they're all cyborgs, but these killer automaton-like beings who have phenomenal power, who look like other characters, who have these unseen technologies, so on and so forth, right? Whereas Frankie reminds me of Inspector Gadget. He's funny, he's goofy, he's got the same sort of technological advances in him, but they're used for funny things like flashing nipples or what have you. It's very goofy and very great. But what's super interesting about this, and spoilers ahead, I should say, if you couldn't understand anything I've just said from this point forward, spoilers ahead. Okay, you have been warned. Late, but you've been warned. So what's interesting about this is that in One Piece, you usually get a character who is the initial example of a concept, and then that is followed by a more defined version of that concept. The most prominent example that comes to mind for me is that during Drum Island, you have our first true Zoan fruit user. I know what you're going to say if you're caught up with the anime and manga. Luffy was the first Zoan, baba gaba gaba. Listen. We didn't know that back then, okay? So for all intents and purposes, in this example, Dalton was the first Zoan. He was a very straightforward Zoan in how he was presented. He's just a guy that can turn into a bison. Okay. Very clear cut. He's got his regular state. He's got the full bison state, and then he's got his hybrid state. And then his variant of the hybrid state is basically how a lot of human Zoans look. Like a lot of them, especially if they're mammals, like Lucy and Kaku and so on and so forth. But yeah, he is sort of like the stock example of what a Zoan is, of what a Zoan user can be. Then later on in Drum Island, we get Chomper, and Chomper is a cornucopia of a whole lot of different things that carry us through the rest of the narrative, basically. Because one, from him, we find out that animals can eat fruits. That was not a concept known to us at that point. And then he is an animal that ate a human fruit. So from that, we understand that not only can Zoan fruits contain the essence of animals, but they can basically be any kind of living being. And anything can eat these fruits. At least at that point, we knew the animals could eat these fruits. And then during the end of the arc, we find out that Zoans really aren't fixed to having 3 transformations, because seeing as how Chomper is a doctor, which is another wild thing to think about, but seeing as how he is a doctor, he found a loophole in which he can manipulate the wavelength of his Doa fruit and give him access to 4 additional forms with a hidden 5th form. So that's really interesting. So Dalton was the initial example, and then Chomper was the more defined example of what a Zoan truly could be. And then later on in the series, we find out that Zoans can just manipulate their bodies and kind of become whatever they want. So what I say all that to say is Frankie was the initial cyborg in the series. Frankie is so important because upon his introduction, the technological ceiling of the series skyrocketed, because when you think about it, from this point, we have only been aware of kind of like weird steampunk-like technology or the creative use of naturally occurring objects like the dials in Skypiea. So we haven't really gotten to big technological leaps in the series at this point. We were introduced to the Sea Train at the start of Water 7, which in itself is a marvel, but then to be introduced to Frankie, who is our first cyborg, opens up an entire can of worms. And what's so interesting about him is that right after Enies Lobby, we get KUMA. KUMA is the defined version of the cyborg in One Piece, which then, of course, as you know, if you've been reading Egghead or the series up to Egghead, that it goes real deep off the pacifista concept, because from KUMA's reveal as a cyborg, we now know that laser technology exists, and it is at least alluded to that facial recognition technology exists. But what is so interesting is that Frankie was the first one to comment on how weird KUMA's power was, and he's the one that got hit first. This then is very interesting when you consider that KUMA sent Frankie during Sabaody Archipelago to Vegapunk's old lab. Now, it's never actually said what's in Vegapunk's old laboratory, but thanks to the weird time map that's set up in KUMA's flashback, we can at least assume that the Pacifista project was on his mind, and those blueprints were most likely in his old lab, because we also know that Vegapunk has known Kizaru for a very, very long time before he became an admiral. So studies on the glint glint fruit probably had gone on in that lab. So it makes sense, based on how Frankie turned out after the time skip, that all the powers that he gained were from the blueprints in Vegapunk's lab, because I'm still under the impression, seeing as how he went from that lab to Punk Hazard to Egghead Island straight after, in the span of the latter half of the story. Like, I believe this is happening during when the story's about to pop off, or like a year before. So it's very recent that Egghead became what it was, or what it is rather, which is weird when you think about it, based on how many things are going on in Egghead and how advanced it is. But it does make sense that those blueprints would be rather fresh, and everything that exists to make a pacifista would be left behind. So all of Frankie's upgrades do make sense. Now, what's interesting about it is that Frankie becomes larger, not around the same size as KUMA, but he's closer than he was before. And then the interesting part that kind of grabs me is that when you think about KUMA, right? KUMA has the pawpaw fruit. So he has a hand within a hand. There's a literal paw within his palm, right? He has a hand within a hand. What Frankie ends up doing to himself is the same thing. He has a smaller hand within his larger hand, which is fascinating to me, because it's just the joke. And it's even funnier because he was the first one to be hit by KUMA's ability. So it's just interesting and very funny that he would design himself in such a way that he too has a hand within his hand. However, this is due to him trying to be practical as well as be useful, because he says the smaller hands are for doing intricate work, which in that way it makes sense, because his hands are normally too large to do that type of stuff. But I just find it fascinating that the joke is carried in a very Inspector Gadget-like way, in that he has a hand within his hand. And then, unlike KUMA, who shoots the beams from his mouth in a very almost bestial-like manner, Frankie does his best Kamehameha impression and shoots his radical beam like a beam, like something you would see out of Dragon Ball or a Super Sentai cartoon, which fits his personality. The other thing that is pretty funny is that the pacifistas from KUMA to the Seraphim have the ability to shoot these lasers, which come from Kizaru. Which, at a point about that, it's very interesting that the lasers are introduced in Thriller Bark, and then we find the origin of where they come from in the very next arc. I just find that cool. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that the beams are a terrifying piece of technology in all the hands of all the users. However, Frankie is the only one who uses this technology in a funny way with the nipple lights. That just speaks to his personality and why I feel like he's a parody of Kuma, because something so serious and so devastating is then turned into a funny gag. He even does it in the anime. He uses Morse code with his nipple lights. It's great. I love it. But the funny thing about all of this is that he stands alone in being a parody of Vegapunk's work, which is why it's so incredible that he then meets the man who came up with all these concepts in the Egghead arc, and he himself has figured out an energy source that Vegapunk had not even thought about. And whereas Kuma kind of had all these modifications placed on him against his will, Frankie had no choice as his body was ruined as he was ran over by the sea train. And what's also interesting on top of that is, from Kuma's entire backstory up into the latest chapter, his back is seen as a point of strength. But with Frankie, no matter what the modification he has gone under, his back has always been his weak point. So I find that a very fascinating concept, because it's at least hinted at that in both cases, the back was unmodified, because there are no significant plating or emphasis put on Kuma's back either. Same with Frankie. But Kuma, in being a buccaneer, is just built different as opposed to Frankie. So on one end, you have an example of how strong the race is, where on the other end with Frankie, you get to see his humanity and how he cannot turn his back on an opponent, literally, which I find oddly manly, which is very fitting of his character. So one can never run, but the other will curl up to protect the ones he loves. I find that fascinating between the two characters. In that way, I would still consider it a parody, but a very cool parody in which the two characters are dynamically opposed to one another. Another very cool and interesting thing is that, which I don't know if Frankie got this from Kuma or is Oda making that the intent that he got this from Kuma, but it's very funny that Kuma's hair seemingly transformed once he ate the pawpaw fruit, because once he got older, he actually grew his hair out because, as a child, he's bald. The hair took the shape of bear ears, right? In both the pre and post time skip, Frankie's hair is a very significant part of his character, because in the pre-time skip, it was a gauge of how much energy he had left, how much cola he had at his disposal to pull off all of his interesting maneuvers. Whereas in the post-time skip, this weakness has been mitigated thanks to the old blueprints of Vegapunk, and now the hair serves as a very character building and interesting cosmetic, because he can just push in his nose, much like the button he pushed in on Vegapunk's old home island to blow up the laboratory. But yeah, he pushes in his nose and his hair can become whatever he wants it to be, which in itself is great, because his modifications in being more like Kuma kind of led to a hair modification, just like how Kuma's fruit led to his hair being modified. So I find that a very interesting and funny parody. And it goes all through the weeds with Frankie, because his hair has become stag beetles and whales and a gun at some point. So it's really run the gamut of having all these interesting shapes. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching.